Hi, I'm Steven from Redshift Sports, and in this video we're going to cover the setup and installation of your ShockStop Suspension Seatpost. A couple of notes about compatibility. The post is designed for a 27.2 millimeter diameter seat tube. If you're unsure about what diameter seat post your bicycle has, the seat post diameter is often printed or stamped onto the bottom of the seat post below the minimum insertion line. You can also check your manufacturer's website, or if you're still unsure, your local bike shop can definitely help you figure out what seat post diameter your bike has. If your bike has a larger seat tube, you can buy a shim like this to fit the 27.2 millimeter diameter ShockStop seat post. It's important to note that you should buy a shim that's at least 4 inches or about 100 millimeters long to ensure that your frame and the seat post are not damaged. We sell them at redshiptsports.com. They're also widely available in your local bike shop or on Amazon if you so prefer. If your seat post diameter on your bike is less than 27.2, then unfortunately you are out of luck and the ShockStop seat post will currently not fit your bike. It's also worth noting that the ShockStop seat post will not fit, unfortunately, bikes with oval or arrow-shaped seat posts. So it's only going to fit a standard round seat post that's 27.2 millimeters diameter or larger. All right, so when you receive your seat post, you're going to get two things. Basically, you'll get the seat post itself, pretty straightforward, but you will also receive an additional spring. And you're going to use this spring if you want a firmer, stiffer suspension setup, and we're going to cover that in kind of our setup guide. So in the instructions, you'll find a chart that gives you some guidelines for initial setup on your seat post. Now, please keep in mind, these are really just starting point recommendations. People have a wide variety of preferences for how they want their seat post to feel, and things like your riding position and the type of terrain that you are riding on are going to have a really big effect on the exact seat post setup that you want. So if you're riding an upright e-bike, you may need a little bit more preload because more of your weight is going to be on your saddle. If you're riding an aggressive road bike position on smoother roads, you may want a different setup to make the seat post feel perfect for you. So don't be afraid to experiment. You can use this guide as kind of a starting point, but definitely don't be afraid to experiment going up or down in terms of suspension stiffness until you find your perfect setting. The first thing I'm going to cover is actually installing the internal secondary spring. So if you look at the chart and decide that for your setting you're going to want both the external and the internal spring, what you're going to do is you're going to take the seat post, you're going to turn it upside down and simply remove this preload wedge by hand. If you are having difficulty moving it, you can also take a 4 millimeter Allen wrench. You can insert it through the holes and use that for some additional leverage. So once you have this out, you can tip the seat post upside down and there's going to be a few parts that come out. The first part is this spacer, and the spacer actually has a diagram on it that shows you the orientation of the internal parts when you go to put this back together. So handy to keep there. And then there's going to be a small black end cap, the spring itself, and another end cap, which in this case is kind of stuck on to the spring. So what you can do is you can leave this first end cap inside the seat post. You can just drop it in here, give it a little shake to make sure that it's flat. And then you're going to put the spring in. And the important thing to note here is that one end of the spring has a heat shrink sleeve on it that keeps it running smoothly inside the seat post. That end needs to go into the seat post first. So you're going to want to place that in with the heat shrink first. And then if you need the inner spring, you can take the inner spring, drop it in, give it a little shake and make sure that it's gone fully down inside the outer spring. You're going to reinstall the second black end cap. Last but not least, you're going to reinstall the spacer. Once you've done that, you can take your preload plug, line it back up, and thread it back into place. So that's how you go about either installing or removing, obviously, the inner spring. It's important to note that you will always have the outer spring installed. Under no circumstances should you ride the seat post with the outer spring removed, because the inner spring alone will not be sufficient to support your weight, and it will also not function properly. So next we're going to cover setting the preload on the suspension seat post. So the preload is essentially your fine-tuning for the stiffness of the suspension linkage. Preload is adjusted using the preload adjustment knob at the bottom of the seat post. And if you look carefully at the adjustment knob, you'll see that there's some numbers etched onto the side, and these indicate the level of preload that you're applying. To increase preload, you basically screw the knob further into the seat post, and to decrease preload, you unscrew it and screw it out. It's important to note here that you always want to have the preload inserted at least to the number 1. That's the minimum level of preload that is required to keep everything in the seat post functioning properly. So you should never be riding with less than that in terms of preload. You can screw this all the way in if you want to get maximum preload. You can screw it in all the way to level 5 until it's basically bottomed out, and that's the maximum level of preload. And again, if you're having any difficulty turning this in, which can sometimes happen as the preload increases because the friction increases, you can take a 4mm Allen wrench, insert it through the holes, and use that for additional leverage. So before you remove your existing saddle and seat post from your bicycle, we typically recommend that you take a couple of measurements of your existing saddle position if you're happy with your existing fit. It helps to take a couple of measurements just so you can recreate that saddle position. So we generally recommend that you take a tape measure, measure from the tip of your saddle to the back of your stem, measure from the center of your saddle or the back of your saddle to a level flat floor, and then measure the tilt angle of your saddle. And the easiest way that we recommend to do that is to use one of the many free angle measurement tools that are available for smartphones. They're very accurate, and they're a very easy way to measure the angle of your saddle and recreate that angle when you set up the ShockStop seat post. Once you've done that, you're going to go ahead and remove your seat post. Obviously, you'll notice that I already have a ShockStop seat post installed on this bicycle, but in this case, you would be removing your existing seat post. And go ahead and remove your saddle from your existing seat post. The first thing you're going to do after you've removed your existing seat post from your bike is just to clean out the seat post tube. You want to make sure that there's no grit or dirt that's in there that could jam up the seat post. You also want to just run your finger around here and make sure there are no sharp edges along the top of the seat tube that could gouge the seat post as you're inserting it. Once you've done that, if you have a metal frame bike, so a steel or aluminum frame bike, typically you're going to want to apply a thin layer of grease to the outside of the seat post in order to prevent the seat post from seizing inside the frame. So this is something that's very important. If you don't apply grease and you put the seat post into a metal frame, after a long time, the two materials can weld together and it can be very difficult to remove a seat post. So we recommend applying grease if you have a metal frame bike. If you have a carbon frame bike, you're going to want to follow your manufacturer's recommendations in terms of what sort of paste or assembly paste you might want to use during assembly. Typically, you're not going to want to grease the seat post if you're inserting it into a carbon frame bicycle, but follow your manufacturer's recommendations there. So once we've applied a layer of grease, insert it to approximately the correct height. You can note the height markings along the back of the seat post to adjust the exact height here. And then just lightly tighten this to hold the seat post in place. And we'll torque this to final torque later on in the process. So now you're going to take a 4mm Allen wrench. You're going to pull the fender off the back here. And the fender is just held on by a magnet. And so while we're doing this adjustment, you can actually take the fender and you can clip it to the top of the bolt here to just keep it out of the way. From the back of the seat post, we're going to go ahead and loosen these two bolts. And we're going to loosen them almost to the point where the bolt is completely out of the nut, but not quite. So for most people, that will allow you to insert the saddle without completely disassembling the seat post clamp, which can make things a little bit easier. So if you take your saddle, you basically need to work it in between the upper and the lower saddle clamps. And once you've gotten it to this point, you're going to want to take that same 4mm Allen wrench and just lightly tighten both the front and rear saddle clamp bolts. It's worth noting that for certain types of saddle rails, if you have ovalized saddle rails, you may need to completely disassemble the saddle clamp. That is, take the saddle clamp bolts completely out of the nuts to insert and reassemble your saddle rails into the clamp. In that case, it's important to remember that the lower saddle clamp here is not completely symmetrical front and rear. The longer saddle rail support section should face the rear of the saddle as you're reassembling the clamp. Once you get your saddle installed, you're going to go ahead and set your saddle fore aft position and saddle angle tilt. And this is where the measurements that you took earlier are going to be very handy. Because we recommend that you run the seat post with about 20% sag, you're going to want to set your fore aft position about 5mm further forward than your previous saddle position and about 6mm higher than your previous saddle position. And that's to account for the slightly rearward and downward motion of the saddle as it compresses into that recommended sag. Now, please keep in mind, you may want to run a different sag amount than what we recommend at 20% to give yourself either a plusher or a firmer ride. It's totally fine if you want to ride the seat post topped out so that it only activates over larger bumps. But we typically recommend 20% sag for really kind of an optimized comfort level that will give you a nice, comfortable, smooth ride. So now that these are lightly tightened, what you're going to want to do is set your saddle tilt. Basically, you're going to want to adjust the saddle tilt by alternately loosening or tightening the front and rear bolts. So to tilt the saddle further forward, you're going to want to loosen the rear bolt and tighten the front bolt. And vice versa, to tilt the saddle further backward, you're going to want to loosen the front bolt and tighten the rear bolt. As you're setting the saddle tilt, a couple important things to keep in mind. You want to make sure that the upper saddle clamp is never contacting the front linkage or the rear linkage as you're tilting the saddle. There should always be space between the upper saddle clamp and the linkages, and that's to make sure that the saddle is clamped correctly and also that none of the parts are rubbing as the seat post moves through its suspension travel. So once you've gotten your saddle angle set, and again, using a smartphone is a great way to do that. Once you've gotten that set, snug both bolts down just by hand until they're both approximately the same tightness, hand tight. Once you have the bolts snug, we're going to go ahead and torque the saddle clamp bolts to their final torque. For this, you're going to need a torque wrench with a 4mm bit and a standard 4mm hex wrench. So starting with the front bolt, we're going to insert the torque wrench and torque the front bolt by 1/4 to 1/6 turn increments, so small increments. We're going to alternate between the front bolt and the rear bolt. And the reason I'm using a standard hex wrench for the rear bolt is because in most cases a torque wrench won't fit and won't provide you access to this rear bolt. So I'm going to torque the rear bolt by 1/4 turn. I'm going to go back to the front bolt. the rear bolt. Okay, and as soon as you reach the correct torque on the front bolt with your torque wrench, you're done torquing the saddle clamp bolts. You can go ahead and reinsert the fender. The fender basically just clips on to one of the interior bolts using a magnet and stays in place. We always recommend using the fender whenever you're riding. It helps keep the seat post clean. Obviously, there's a lot of dirt and mud that gets thrown up by the rear wheel, and so the fender will just help keep all of that off of the seat post internals. If you happen to be running certain types of saddlebags that clip onto the saddle rails and also attach to the seat posts, in that case you may want to remove the fender. If you do reattach the fender, it's important to remember that there's a little O-ring tether on the top of the fender, and that's designed to go around the rear saddle clamp bolt between the two saddle clamps, between the upper and the lower, and that just keeps the fender in place in case it gets knocked loose or in case you need to do some maintenance while you're out on the trail. You won't forget it. So once you have your seat post installed, you're going to want to go ahead and torque your seat post clamp here to your manufacturer's recommended torque setting. And you're going to want to sit on the bike to determine exactly where you are with respects to the 20% preload that we recommend. So as a visual guideline, for 20% preload, there's a pivot shaft that's visible on the side of the post. It's a silver shaft. So when you're in a neutral riding position, 20% sag is going to be where the end of that silver shaft is just barely hidden behind the side of the seat post when viewed directly from the side. So that's going to be a nice visual indicator that lets you set that sag level. Obviously, it will be a little bit difficult to see that by yourself when you're on the bike. So we recommend enlisting the help of a friend to help you set that up. And then what you're going to do is you're going to remove the seat post and then adjust the preload plug at the bottom of the seat post, reinstall it, and then go from there until you've reached that 20% sag number. So once you have the sag set to 20%, that in combination with the 6mm higher position that you started with and 5mm further forward saddle position will reproduce your original saddle position when you're sitting on the saddle. In terms of maintenance, there's very little regular maintenance that you'll need to do for the seat post. It's designed to give you years of service with very minimal maintenance. One important thing to note is that you're not going to want to apply any sort of grease or lubricants to the pivots or the bushings of the seat post. They're designed to run dry and they will have their maximum life and durability in that condition. So don't apply any lubricants or oils or greases to any of the pivots in the seat post. In terms of other basic maintenance, the internals of the seat post, you can check and make sure that they're greased. They will come greased from the factory, and you shouldn't need to apply any more grease during normal usage. But that's something, if you're disassembling the seat post regularly, you want to make sure that when you reassemble the internals, that the components have a little bit of grease on them to keep everything sliding smoothly. So that covers the setup and installation of the ShockStop seat post. As always, if you have any questions, we've got additional resources at redshiftsports.com. You can also always reach out to us at support@redshiftsports.com. We try to reply to every single email that we get, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. Thanks so much for choosing the ShockStop Suspension Seatpost. We hope you guys enjoy it as much as we do. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and if you found this video useful, you can subscribe to our channel to get additional videos like this in the future.